what exactly even constitutes as an interracial marriage? That's a term that we hear a lot, but what does that even really mean? And I personally, I understand that a lot of the content on this channel is us discussing race and ethnicity, when ultimately the irony is, I believe that race is just a label that people created. It's a social construct. You know, I get that. I totally get that. But I think maybe the only way for us to mature and move forward with that is to talk about it more. So let's talk about the concept of the phrase interracial marriage. You know, because I think when we think of that, we're going to think something like, you know, a black woman marrying a white man, or vice versa, or someone who's Asian marrying someone who's, you know, we've got all these different colors basically that we're matching up when we think about it. But, you know, and I always say that if you're ethnically Mexican, not just simply that being your nationality, but if you're that predictable mix of, you know, Native American and then European Spanish, you know, by default you're going to be biracial. Same thing if you're an African American. There's no African American person, no black person in history who has ever left a comment saying, Nick, I'm an African American. My ancestors go back, you know, 5 or 6 generations. I took a DNA test and I'm 100% African. That's never happened, and it never will happen. Because so many people are biracial. People typically of Mexican descent, like me, are by default going to be biracial to some degree. If you're a black American, by default, you're going to have European DNA in with the African DNA, by default. Okay? So when people like that marry someone else, automatically it's an interracial marriage. I mean, so what does that mean if you're already biracial? If you're already, let's say someone is Puerto Rican. That's a great example, because as I've discussed on this channel, if you're Puerto Rican, if you take a DNA test, likely what's going to happen is you're going to have European DNA, you're going to have Native American, and you're going to have a little bit of African DNA. By default, you're biracial or triracial by default. So if you marry someone, no matter what, even if they're also Puerto Rican and have a similar DNA background, is that an interracial marriage? Okay, what about my grandparents? All right, so on my mom's side, my grandma being a first-generation Mexican, and she marries a first-generation Italian, okay? So already in your mind, what do you think about when you hear that? Do you, okay, a Mexican and an Italian, and they get married. Is that interracial? By default, by my definition, it is, because being of that Aztec, Mayan, and Spanish European DNA that my grandma was, she was already biracial by default. And then she married my grandfather, who we find out, you know, that now that he's been gone for 10 years, based on multiple DNA tests, more than anything, he was Jewish, Sephardic Jewish, and Middle Eastern. Well, okay, but here in America, how do they perceive someone who's Middle Eastern? A lot of people won't even perceive someone who's Middle Eastern as being white. A lot of people won't. They see that as a different race. They'd say, well, if let's say a Middle Eastern man married a woman with the last name Smith and she had blonde hair, that's an interracial marriage. A lot of people would see it that way. And I think it depends on the person. It depends on the country. You know, I think it depends on a lot of things. But I think the whole point in making this video and discussing this is, we want interracial marriage to be a solid term, that we definitely know what that means. But I don't really think we can know what that means, because ultimately we can't really define race. I think we can only really define race by the experience that goes with it. And it goes back to when I watched the documentary on Netflix called The Racial Divide, where ultimately being a black American means that you have experienced life as a black American. You have lived a different version of life to some degree based on that black experience. Okay? So even if you are only had one parent, one grandparent, let's say one grandparent who is of African descent, well, still though, as far as you being able to relate to that, it's based on the experience that went with it and how you grew up. And I think that goes as far as how you see your own race. I think the physical traits and the DNA maybe is the least important part of it. And maybe it's the culture more than anything, especially if there's, say, different religions. It just so happens that both of my grandparents that married each other were Catholic, and I'm sure that's one of the things that made that marriage easy, because they were both first-generation Americans, but they were both Catholic, and that's one more thing they have in common. Was that an interracial marriage? Am I, and again, I do see myself as biracial to a certain degree, but then if we're going to define, well, what exactly is biracial? If you've got any amount of two different, not just going back to the one drop rule, just referring to Black Americans, but even white Americans. If you have any amount of Native American in you, in your DNA, by default that makes you biracial, right? So interracial marriage, man, it's pretty easy to be in an interracial marriage when you really think about it. That's how I feel about it. But what I feel doesn't really matter. All I did is just start a conversation. I'm about to walk away, but I'm going to be coming back to read the comments to see what you have to say, because what you have to say about the subject is much more important and relevant than what I have to say. So what do you have to say right here?